Cooling systems, why your motorcycle needs it, how they work, and we're going to show you how to change and flush your coolant. Coming up next. Engines make a lot of heat. They're basically giant heat pumps. They turn gasoline into heat and use the expansion of that heat to drive the motorcycle. So there's two ways of getting rid of that heat. One is air-cooled motorcycles. You'll see that as any V-twin cruiser, non-liquid cooled or air-cooled, you'll see fins. The air blows over the fins on the engine, takes the heat away with it, and that's the cooling. Liquid-cooled motorcycles use coolant. The coolant is pumped around the motorcycle's engine, around each cylinder where it picks up the heat from the combustion. That coolant is then pumped to the radiator, and the wind blows through the radiator, picks up the heat from the coolant, and carries it away. Now that coolant, once the heat has been removed, circulates back into the engine and the circuit repeats. It's a closed system. You should never have to add coolant. However, once in a while you should change your coolant. There could be impurities, there could be corrosion, there could be scale. All kinds of things get into your cooling system, and for that reason manufacturers recommend that the coolant be changed every 5 years or so, depending on the engine, depending on the type of engine. We're going to do that today on my GL1500 Goldwing. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to flush and clean the radiator. Now you may have seen engines boiling over, where the steam is flying up out of the engine. So what exactly is that? Well, if you think about it, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, depending on your location. And by location, I mean altitude. Have you ever seen cooking instructions where it says cook longer at higher altitudes? People who live in Denver, for instance, know that water boils quite a bit lower temperature than it does at sea level. So while water boils at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, up in Denver, it might be closer to 200 degrees Fahrenheit and maybe 95 degrees Celsius. So as pressure decreases, the boiling point of water also decreases. The higher the boiling point of the water, the more heat you can put into it before it boils. So it's in our best interest to get our coolant to not be able to boil at the highest temperature possible. There's two ways of doing that. One is by adding a coolant to it. Instead of using just water, we add a chemical, in this case ethylene glycol. It serves two purposes. One, it keeps the coolant from freezing in cold temperatures, and two, the combination of ethylene glycol and water together has a higher boiling point than water alone. Incidentally, water and ethylene glycol together also have a higher boiling point than ethylene glycol alone, which is why you always want to mix your coolant in the case of concentrated coolant, or if you buy 50-50 premix, the water's already been added for you. So the other way we can stop coolant from boiling over is by increasing pressure. As I mentioned, we have at sea level, the ambient air pressure is higher. So how can we increase the pressure in our cooling system? Well, that's where the radiator cap comes into play. We'll have a look at that in a minute once we start taking the bike apart. Let's have a look at the radiator cap on my Goldwing. First, I'm going to take the key bridge off. Just pops off and out of the way like that. And next we have these inner covers. The inner covers are not too hard to get out. It does take a little practice to be able to done quickly. You just pull the inside back like that, and then the next latch around there, and then pull it backwards and out. And that's about all there is to it. And while we're at it, let's do the other side as well. That gives us access to both the coolant reservoir and the radiator cap. Now let's remove the radiator cap. No, not yet. Let me give you a warning first. Remember what I said about pressure? Remember what I said about boiling water? You might be getting the hint that our cooling system is under pressure, and you'd be right. Let's think about what would happen if we had coolant that is hotter than it would boil at ambient pressure, pressurized inside our cooling system, and we suddenly let it out by opening the radiator cap. You can probably guess. It's going to explode with superheated steam blowing up in your face and scalding you and burning you very badly. That's why whenever you remove the radiator cap or do any work on your cooling system, the bike has to be dead cold. Never, ever, ever open a radiator cap when the engine is hot. My bike is cold because, well, it's snowing outside, so let's remove the radiator cap. It's spring-loaded, so we need to push down on it and then turn. You'll feel it stop halfway through. That's a lock to prevent you from burning yourself, hopefully, if you were dumb enough to remove it when it was hot. Keep turning it, and it will come right off. And careful, it is going to drip a bit of coolant. And so here it is. Notice the very important warning on the top of it. Really, seriously, pay attention to that warning. Look at the bottom. You'll see a plunger and a spring. You see that spring in there, and this plunger is actuated, pushes that spring in. So here's how it works. This radiator cap is down inside the neck of the radiator, and if you see this rubber seal around here, seals the neck of the radiator. As the bike heats up, it starts heating up that coolant that's moving around inside the cooling system. It expands. Water expands just like everything else. When it heats up, it expands. As it expands, it starts pushing up on this little spring here. And this spring is precisely calibrated to allow the coolant to become pressurized to the exact correct amount, which is on most vehicles around 14 psi. So what happens when the coolant raises up high enough that it pushes that spring all the way up? Well, you can see on the side there's a little hole in the side of the radiator neck connected to a hose. So once that spring gets pushed up far enough, the excess coolant gets pushed up along that hose, and you guessed it, into the coolant reservoir. So all the extra coolant ends up in the coolant reservoir. What happens when it cools off? Well, the fluid starts pulling back down as it contracts and a vacuum forms, and that vacuum pulls coolant out of the coolant reservoir back into the radiator. Now, if you ever had a problem with your cooling system where you were constantly having to add coolant to the radiator, and somehow the coolant reservoir just kept getting fuller and fuller and wasn't going back into the radiator, here's what your problem is. The coolant reservoir is plastic, and as that hose connects onto the little plastic nib on the side of the coolant reservoir, that plastic once in a while can crack. So what happens is the coolant gets pushed into the reservoir just fine. You might get a few drops of coolant here and there. The real problem is when it tries to suck the coolant back from the reservoir into the radiator. Instead of sucking the coolant up out of the reservoir, it instead sucks air through that little crack. And so now your radiator is sucking air, and all the coolant it's pushed out stays in the coolant reservoir. The next time you start it, it raises up, pushes that air out, and then exact same thing happens. It just sucks more air back in. So then if you look at the coolant level in your radiator, you'll see it's low because it sucked air in there, and all that coolant that was there is now in the coolant reservoir. That's generally a means of replacing your coolant reservoir. In rare cases, you might be able to fix it, but it's probably going to be a temporary fix at best. So what we're going to do is clean our cooling system, and then we're going to replace the coolant. We're going to need a couple things to do that. First off, we're going to need some cleaner. This is a very common radiator cleaner. It's safe for aluminum radiators. It's also safe for iron engines if you should be using one of those. We're going to pour that into the radiator after we've drained it, the coolant, fill it up with the rest of the way with water. We'll run the engine, let it run for a little bit so that this cleaner can clean out the scale and deposits inside our cooling system. Then we'll drain it out, flush it once more with just water, drain that out, and then we're going to replace it with coolant. Now, I use this Honda HP coolant. It's obviously designed for this bike. It's a premix. You don't have to add water to it already. All you do is you open it up, pour it in, you're good to go. Now, I use the Honda coolant because I know it's a high quality coolant. I've got experience using it. I've had nothing but excellent results with it. But any quality coolant that is silicate free will work just fine. Now, silicate is an abrasive that is added to some coolants. The idea is that it circulates through your cooling system. It will clean out deposits. However, on our aluminum motorcycle engines with the plastic Bakelite and aluminum impellers and the water pump, it just does disastrous things. It will eat away the seals of your water pump, and you'll find yourself having to replace a water pump or worse in fairly short order. Never, ever, ever use silicate containing coolant in your motorcycle. How do you know if your coolant is silicate free? Generally, if it is, it will say silicate free or does not contain silicates. This one doesn't. I don't know if that means it contains silicates, but it definitely does not say silicate free. I would never actually use this in my motorcycle for that reason. To be safe, I've never had a problem with this Honda coolant. In fact, the one time I did use a regular automotive coolant on my motorcycle, it was my GL1100 Goldwing. Within 3 to 4 months after I did that coolant change, my water pump failed. Coincidence? Maybe, but you know what? I've never had a failure with Honda coolant, so that's what we're gonna use. The other thing we're gonna need is a giant drain pan. This one's several gallons. That'll be enough for what we're gonna use. If you have a smaller one, you may have to empty it a few times.
Getting up underneath this motorcycle, you can see here's the oil filter. This is underneath the front cowling. Next to the oil filter, we have the water pump. Right here, at the bottom of the water pump, is our drain. We're going to be removing that 10mm bolt, and that's what will drain the coolant. You want to get your hand on that bolt once you start loosening it, because you don't want to drop it inside that tank and then lose it. And out it comes. There's about 4 quarts of coolant draining out of there now. I should note that you do not want to leave this tray of coolant sitting around if you have pets or small children. It's extremely toxic, and both pets and small children find it extremely appetizing because it has a very sweet taste. If you leave this out and you have dogs or cats, I guarantee they will lap it up, and that'll be the end of your dog or cat, so please be careful. If we look at the bolt that came out, it has a copper crush washer on there. Now, Honda would have you replace that crush washer every single time you remove this bolt, which is not very often. I think this is probably only the second time this bolt's ever been removed. I'm not going to bother replacing it. It's still in fine shape. It'll seal great. If I notice a few drops of coolant on the floor afterwards, then maybe I'll think about it. But for the amount of times this has ever been changed, it doesn't need it. Okay, so the coolant is pretty much drained out. It's a few drips left. I'm going to reinstall this drain bolt. As always, you want to tighten it by hand first. Make sure you're not cross-threading, because it is a small bolt. It's easy to cross-thread. Snug it up by hand, then use your wrench just to do the final tightening. You don't have to wail on this thing. As I said, it has a crush washer, so it doesn't take a whole lot to seal. As you can see, my coolant now resides in this pan, and I've got enough space in this pan to do this probably 2 or 3 times more. All right, next step, flushing. We're going to pour this into our radiator and then fill it the rest of the way with water. Once again, we don't want to have coolant going everywhere, so I'm going to use a funnel to very neatly get the coolant back into the cooling system without spilling everywhere. So of course these bottles will have a seal in them that you'll have to break. Be careful with the seal, it's foil. You don't want pieces of foil going in your cooling system. Same goes for changing your oil. Be careful with these seals, because if you do get a little piece of aluminum seal in your cooling system, or worse, in your engine, it can be a very bad day for you. So, start pouring the flush compound into the radiator. You don't want to overflow it, so just pour it as fast as it will take it. It takes a little while because it has to filter its way down into the engine, through the radiators, and everywhere else. Next step is water. Now, if you're using water with a undiluted coolant, that water must be distilled water. If you put regular tap water full of minerals into your cooling system, you'll just attack it and coat it with scale, and you'll have bad cooling problems. In this case, this is simply filtered water. It's not staying in the motorcycle for more than a few minutes, so it doesn't really matter. Tap water works fine for this as well. As you get near the top of the radiator, you'll have to wait more and more to let the water flow down inside to prevent it from overflowing. You want to get it as close to the top of the neck of the radiator as possible. As you can see here, I've got the water right up to the top of the radiator neck. Actually, it's probably a little bit too high, but that'll be fine. Once we start it, it's going to suck down in there. And that is the next step, starting it. So what we're going to do is run the motorcycle without the radiator cap on it. What's going to happen is as soon as we start the motorcycle, it's going to start circulating that coolant, and as it does, air is going to bubble and be pumped up from around inside the engine and make its way up and out of the radiator neck. As that happens, we may want to add some more water just to try and keep it up as close to the top of the radiator neck as possible. But we're going to run this motorcycle for about 10 minutes or so, just long enough for the cleaner to do its work. I'm going to open the garage door before I do that because I really don't want to asphyxiate myself. You can see the bubbles bubbling up. I'm going to add some more water now. Now we're going to run the engine like this for about 10 minutes. I'm going to keep an eye on the coolant level because as it heats up, it's going to expand, and of course, because we don't have that radiator cap in place, it's not going to be able to force its way out into the reservoir and could potentially overflow and just make a mess. So I'm going to shop rag, and if I do see it starting to come up and in danger of overflowing, I'll just mop some of it up and soak it up so that it doesn't overflow. You can definitely see the cleaner is causing a little bit of foaming up, so you know it's working at descaling. Anytime that cleaner comes in contact with minerals or scale that it's trying to clean out, it will foam up like that. So that foam is rising to the top, and as it does, it's bubbling up. So that tells us that the cleaner is actually working and that this system was actually in need of some cleaning. One thing you should never ever be tempted to do is run a liquid-cooled engine with no coolant in it, even just for a minute. The cylinders are dependent on the coolant taking that heat away. It's an incredible amount of concentrated heat in those cylinders, and if that coolant's not there, you very quickly overheat and melt both the cylinders, pistons. Basically, you'll destroy your engine. It's not a good thing. Never run your engine without coolant in it. All right, that's 10 minutes. We'll turn it off. I'm going to shut the garage, warm up a bit, and then we'll drain out the descaler cleaner solution. All right, same deal as before. We're going to loosen that drain bolt and drain out the coolant. We have to be a little more careful this time because it's going to be fairly hot. It won't be as hot as if you just come off the highway riding, but it's definitely going to be warm. As you can see, it's warm enough that we're seeing steam. All right, that's drained out. We'll replace the drain bolt once more. And for the next step, we're going to do it all over again, but this time we're going to do it with water. What we want to do is make sure that we flush all that flushing compound out of the engine. It's a little bit corrosive by nature. It has to be in order to get rid of the scale. So we want to make sure that we get rid of all of that stuff out of the engine so it doesn't remain in there and start attacking the innards of the engine. All right, we've opened the garage again one more time, and we're going to start it and run for another 10 minutes. As before, we'll add water as needed as the engine starts pulling it in and spitting air out instead. As you can see here, I have a little bit of water dripping out the bottom of the motorcycle. That's because I accidentally let it overflow a little bit, and it's dripped down from the top through the middle of the bike out the bottom. That doesn't hurt anything, it's just water. It'll dry out and it'll be fine. Same thing happens to you, don't sweat it. All right, that's another 10 minutes idling with water and nothing else in the cooling system. Time to drain it once more. Now I'm going to warn you, we've had this bike idling for 20 minutes. The engine is extremely hot, and so is the coolant that we're going to be draining out here. It is easily hot enough to seriously burn you. So we're going to be extremely careful when removing this bolt. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to loosen it just so it's tight enough to, or loose enough that I can remove it with my fingers. I'm going to push in on the bolt as I'm turning it to keep the coolant from leaking out, or the water. And I can already feel it on my hands. It's extremely hot. Oh, ow, ow, ow. Okay, like I said, and also wear gloves. Okay, let's see if I do this really quick so I don't burn myself. And out we come. Oh, that's hot. As you can see, we should be getting quite a bit of steam out of here now. It's very, very hot water. How much coolant do you need to replace after doing a complete drain and flush? It's about 4 quarts, depending on the bike. You want to check your owner's manual, but generally, especially for the 1500, it's going to be 4 quarts. 4 quarts will give you more than enough to do a complete drain and refill. If you wanted evidence as to whether you actually need to flush your cooling system or not, you need to look no further than the threads of the drain bolt. You notice there's quite a bit of scale on those threads, and those threads point up and are covered in, that goes up inside the water pump, and coolant flows over those threads. So if those threads are coated in scale like you see there, you can pretty much assume that the rest of the engine and cooling system, the radiators, water pump, everything, is coated in that same scale. That's what the flush is removing. Okay, the hot water is drained out. Now we're going to replace this screw, hopefully not dipping my hand in this hot water and burning myself. Okay, so we'll slide our drain tank out of the way, drain pan. And please, have some environmental friendliness. Don't go dumping your used coolant down the sewer or down the drain. Dispose of it properly. Most auto stores will take used coolant, and if you don't, you can hang on to it if your city has a chemical day where you can take chemicals to the dump along with paint and that sort of thing. Don't just dump it, because it is really nasty stuff, and like I said, it will kill animals that find it and drink it. Okay, now we're gonna snug up this drain bolt for the last time. All right, we're getting close to the end. Next, we're going to fill the cooling system with brand new coolant. Like the cleaner bottles, or the descaler, the coolant bottles also have an aluminum seal in the neck. Same thing goes. You want to slit that seal open, peel the aluminum away, make sure it doesn't fall into your engine. It does really nasty things when it gets in there. Just peel it off good, make sure there's no little bits left before you start pouring it into your bike. I see Honda has changed their formulation. Last time I used this HP coolant, it was green. Now it's blue. I should make a note that Honda doesn't actually make this stuff. It says Honda on it, but it's not Honda. Of course, just like most other things that they sell in terms of filters and consumables, Honda doesn't make any of that stuff. They go to various manufacturers and they work out a deal. They spec what they want made, and then it gets made to Honda's spec, and then Honda slaps a label on it and doubles the price and sells it to you. That said, when you do buy the Honda products, you can be reasonably sure that you're getting a decent quality product and that it's spec'd correctly for the application. In particular, the Honda oil filters, I'm not sure who they're made by right now. They do change manufacturers from time to time, but they are consistently some of the best oil filters on the market. It's tough to find an aftermarket oil filter that is of as high quality as the Honda oil filters. So I pretty much stick to Honda oil filters as well when I'm servicing my bikes. Okay, so I filled it up pretty much to the very top of the radiator neck with all the coolant that I have. It's not taking 4 quarts, like I said. We've still got, it's hard to tell, but roughly 1/3 of a quart left in this bottle. We will be needing that, so don't throw it away. All right, we filled up the coolant, and next step, once again, start it up. Now we're actually not looking to start it to try to heat up the coolant and circulate it for any amount of time like we were before. What we're trying to do now is just work the air out of the system. So as the engine runs, it's going to start pumping fluid through, and the bubbles are going to gradually work their way up to the highest point, which is that radiator fill neck. So as the bubbles come up, we need to add more coolant to make sure that we leave it topped up. You will notice that if you use the throttle and just give it a few little revs as it goes, it kind of helps to get the bubbles moving through. So if you see it's kind of stalled and the bubbles aren't coming up anymore, just give it a few more revs, just make sure you've got all the air out. And once you're pretty sure you've got the air out, then you can turn the engine off. Be ready with your coolant because you're going to need to keep filling it. Okay, we've run the bike for, I guess, about 4 or 5 minutes. We've revved it up several times, saw lots of bubbles coming up. Pretty much stopped seeing the bubbles, so I'm going to call it more or less full. As we shut it off, it's going to cool off, go down a bit, so we'll just top that up. But we're not finished. Okay, so we've run the engine for about 5 minutes. We saw lots of bubbles come up, and then it pretty much stabilized. We gave it one last top up, and now we're ready to put the radiator cap back in place. You'll see the 2 little tabs on the radiator cap. And those fit into the 2 little tabs on either side. So let's put the cap back on there. So you'll see those tabs fit into the little slots on the neck. And then you start turning, and you're going to feel it. It turns about 1/4 of a turn, and it feels like it's in place. That's not tight. Keep turning it, and turning it, and turning it until it stops turning. And now my hands are slippery. Let me just switch hands here. Okay, so you saw I put the cap on. It was pretty much upside down when I started, and now you can see the orientation of it. That's on tight all the way. However, we are not finished, because if we look over on the left side, we have a coolant reservoir, and you can see this little rubber cap. We can just pull that off, and you should be very familiar with this because you pull this out to check your coolant level all the time, right? Of course you do. Okay, so we're going to pull that out. Now what we want to do is empty that coolant reservoir. Now Honda, in their service manual, says remove the coolant reservoir to clean it. That's a real nasty job. You have to pull the whole false tank off. You have to pull the intake system out just to get to this bolt. I'm not doing it. So what I do is I put a little hose in there, and I just suck all the nasty old coolant out, fill it with some water, suck it out again. After a couple rounds of that, it's reasonably clean. Then we'll fill it with coolant. And here's what I use. It's a simple, cheap, hand-operated vacuum pump. I'm pretty sure this came from Harbor Freight and didn't cost more than $10, if that. Probably had a coupon. I got 99 cents. They work fairly well. Honestly, they're so cheap, I tend to not even clean them. Once they get kind of nasty, I just chuck them and buy another one. Harbor Freight's great. So what I'm going to do is take the output end of this hose. I wrapped a shop rag around it to try and fix it in place so it doesn't all fall out and then end up dumping coolant all over my bike. And I'll stuff that in there. Hold that hose in place. And of course, if you have a helper, they maybe could hold this end, this bottle, and prevent it from being dumped out everywhere. I do not have a helper with me today, so I'm doing it by myself. And we'll stick the other end of that. That's not going to work. I'm going to put this down here, hold it between my legs, and hope that nothing bad goes down there. Okay, so let's stick this down into the bottom of the coolant reservoir. Okay, I think that's all the coolant I'm going to get out of that. So now we're going to pour some water in there. So that's about all the coolant I'm going to get out of it. So now we're going to fill up the coolant reservoir with water. Once we filled it with water, we will once again pump it out again. Okay, we'll empty out what we've pumped out and then do it again. If you don't have a pump, you could probably do this with a single piece of hose and use it as a siphon. Of course, if you start it by mouth, try not to ingest it because it is rather toxic. Okay, let's have a look at what we got here. We pour this out, and we'll pour that out. As you can see, it's got a slight green tinge left from the previous coolant, but that's mostly water. So I'm going to call that good and clean and ready to fill. The very last step in this process, fill the coolant reservoir with coolant. When I say fill it with coolant, I don't mean actually fill it. You don't want that reservoir too full because then when the engine gets hot, the coolant expands, it has nowhere to go. It will overflow, make a real mess. It'll actually pop this out and you'll have coolant everywhere and smoke, and it's a bad deal. So what we want to do is use this dipstick that's molded into the cap. You can see the two holes on there. You want the coolant level somewhere in between the bottom and the top, and that's when the engine is cold. Now I know this engine is hot because we were just running it, however, it did not push any coolant up into the coolant reservoir, so the coolant reservoir is cold. So that's what we're talking about. We want to make sure that coolant reservoir is at the correct level for the current temperature. So we'll push that in and then pull it out, and it looks like we're just about right at the very top of that range. So we'll call that good. I'm going to push that in and then seal that cap in place. Make sure that cap is on there really well. If you do get high pressure in there, it will pop that cap off and you'll lose it. I've come home after a long ride and went down there to check my coolant and realized that thing was gone. I'm not the only one who's ever had that happen on a GL 1500 before. Okay, job's almost done. All we have to do now is put our inner covers back in place. We do that by threading the tip in, then the side, and then the back. Turn the steering, do the same thing for the other side. Up underneath, top slot, side slot, back slot, done. Okay. Lastly, take the key out so we can put the key bridge in place. Put the front in first, snap the back in place. And that's it. A simple and relatively inexpensive and easy to perform maintenance task that will help your engine last for many years to come. It doesn't cost a whole lot in terms of coolant. This whole process is maybe $20 in coolant and flush, and then of course have some water on hand. Shop towels. Do it for yourself, do it for your bike, keep your bike running well, be safe. If you like this video, you want to see lots more like it, don't forget to click subscribe and the little notification bell. Click like on the video too for good measure. And also don't forget to visit our forums, GoldwingDocs.com. Everything you ever want to know about Goldwings, lots of friendly people willing to help. It's just a great place. Come on and visit us, GoldwingDocs.com. Have a great day.